Hello, good evening. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a keynote speaker at this fantastic conference. And of course, thank you for this lovely introduction. It was all exaggeration, but it's very flattering to be called as the most prominent social scientist in Estonia, but honestly, there are people, yes, so let's not talk about it. Anyhow, when Leonora invited me to give a talk here, I thought, it's wonderful because this is my alma mater. So this is my university, and it's been a while, to be fully honest, when I gave a talk at my university. So it's a wonderful opportunity to give a talk to such a wonderful international audience, so even better, my home turf. But, speaking to you who have traveled here despite all the difficulties from near and afar. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk. I hope you can see. Let me find what I need. I think I need a clicker. So I'm going to talk about well-being. And it's been one of the topics. I've been doing some research, not the only one. And as already mentioned, I published a few papers, maybe too many papers. So it wasn't easy to pick and choose what is it I will talk about. So finally I tried to come up with a story, and I hope it all makes sense. And I'm looking forward to your questions and feedback at the end, because it's going to be some old papers, some new papers, some papers which have been published, some papers which are work in progress, some papers which were published decades ago. When I was preparing this talk, I was actually surprised myself, if I looked at the year of publication, and I thought, that can't be me, publishing this in this journal, back in 1997, it sounds as if it's, anyhow, it was me, it's my paper. So, why well-being? I thought it would suit well to the theme of this conference. As was already mentioned, I'm sort of personality psychologist and cross-cultural psychologist. But actually I was trained as a sociologist. So my first education, my first degree is in sociology. And I think that's why I always kept a bit my interest having a bit broader than just psychology. And well-being is one of those wonderful topics which is quite popular across different fields. So I've been collaborating with people from different disciplines as well. I think it's fair to say that we are still witnessing the era of well-being, at least if not the end of it. It's been going on for some decades now. If you look at some numbers, some figures, you can see how the numbers of publications in databases on well-being have dramatically increased across the past 20 years. And also, it's just a random selection of different books published on a topic. So I just Googled, the science of subjective well-being. I know some of them. I've read a few of them, but not all of them. But it just shows how many books are being published, what a lively and interesting sort of topic it seems to be. I think I also need to explain why there has been this growing emphasis of well-being. So I think it starts with broader societal developmental processes, because our basic needs, being increasingly met in different parts of the world, and that of course allows societies to focus on well-being as well, not just on survival. So that could be one of the reasons. Also, there's a cultural shift. Maybe I should move so that I can see what I'm talking about. So cultural shift towards openness, and also sort of greater awareness, reduced stigma. That's definitely one of the reasons. Also, people say that people are more stressed than ever. Is it because of digital overload? Is it because of urbanization? It could be because of social isolation. We talk about loneliness a lot, and so on and so forth. COVID, of course, it was an interesting turning point as well, because it definitely exposed, and also, according to some scholars, it sort of like intensified global mental health challenges. And also more and more employers, they sort of like reckon the importance of well-being because of workers' burnout, because of mental health issues. Well-being affects productivity and so on and so forth. So yeah, so it seems to be like all these different factors have together contributed to the sort of growing importance of well-being topic. In many studies, I wouldn't say most studies, but in many studies, well-being is seen as an outcome. So this is something we strive for. We want people to feel better, to have more meaningful lives, to be more satisfied with their lives. But at the same time, there are quite some studies which show that it's not just an outcome, but it's also a cause. And that could be one of the reasons as well, because it's not just that, you know, it's an outcome of nice things. It could be also the other way around. So when we talk about well-being, and when I talk about well-being this evening, I need to be clear about what is it I'm talking about. So very broadly speaking, and I'm sure many of you know this, but very broadly speaking, we can talk about two different kinds of well-being. Of course, it's not the only classification, but for the purposes of this talk, I think it works well. So we talk about hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being. And my talk is going to be focused on subjective well-being. So this is sort of like, which is also sometimes called hedonic well-being. So this is about pleasure, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain. It's about also sort of short-term gratification, whereas psychological well-being is more about like seeking meaning in life. It's about self-realization. So these are like sort of related, but still different, conceptually and theoretically different things. So my talk, because I only have like 45 minutes, will exclusively focus on subjective well-being. We've done quite some research on psychological well-being as well, but I will keep it for another talk. So subjective well-being and its components, and hopefully you will see why it's important to talk about it to start with. So what is subjective well-being? Subjective well-being is actually, there are different definitions, but the easiest definition is that it's all about emotional and cognitive evaluations of people's lives. So this is what lay people would also say, yeah, this is happiness, this is life satisfaction, this is fulfillment, all these different terms. So it's sort of like, it was kind of invented because happiness was seen as too philosophical. And even though people in everyday language, in everyday use, they would mostly talk about like, you know, and we talk about happiness a lot, but subjective well-being is like a bit more scientific, more academic, but it should include all these different things. And in terms of how it's conceptualized and measured, we can talk about two main components. One is affective component, and the second one is cognitive component. So if we look at the components, we can see that affective component consists of positive and negative emotions, and cognitive component has to do with general life satisfaction. And of course, there are also domain-specific life satisfaction sort of, you know, things. But I'm not going to talk about it in my talk this evening, even though they are important, and I'm sure many of you are interested in those specific kinds of life satisfaction as well. So broadly speaking, people say that people have high levels of subjective well-being when they have high levels of positive emotions, low levels of negative emotions, and they happen to be satisfied with their life. It all seems nice, it kind of makes sense, it looks like a nice monolithic concept, but it's definitely not. And that was something what Ed Dina, who's sort of like sadly passed away a few years ago, he was a great proponent and advocate of subjective well-being. He said it already in his response to journalists quite some years ago, that it's actually an umbrella term. The components are independent or semi-independent, and they're loosely related. And this is very important because we tend to use them quite often like they are the same thing. But what I'm trying to show you is that we have to be very careful about what kind of component of subjective well-being we're interested in, and what does it tell us about people's well-being. So it's possible for people to be high on one, low on another, and so on and so forth. What I've done with my colleagues for many years, we've been interested in the relationships between different components of subjective well-being. And it started with some very simple exercises, and there are wonderful data sets out there. And throughout my talk, I'm going to talk about different cross-cultural data sets, such as European Social Survey. Also, we've used extensively World Values Survey in collaboration with European Values Survey. In addition to those cross-cultural data sets, I will be describing our collaboration with Estonian Biobank. This is something which will come later. And also, we've done quite a few experience sampling type studies in different countries. So these are the main data sets, but I'll start with European Social Survey. So if you just look at across all countries, it doesn't matter which year, it's roughly the same. In this specific round, 29 European countries participated. And you can see that, the relationships are pretty much the same between the three components, all around like 0.40. And they are, of course, in an expected direction as they should be. So this all looks good, but if you dig deeper, you will actually see that there are important cross-national differences in the strength of relationships between these different components. And this gives me a wonderful opportunity to talk about how I actually started doing research on well-being, because we are in Tartu, and it all started in Tartu many years ago. It was when life satisfaction and well-being was just about some people were already interested in it, but it was like more than 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So it was right at the start of this sort of era of well-being. So we investigated the key drivers of life satisfaction in Estonia. We had a wonderful representative samples from all different counties. We came up with these different factors which all independently contributed to the level of life satisfaction. So the usual suspects, higher monthly income, because you guys are interested in this topic. Let me just show you this. Being employed, having citizenship, this is a bit Estonian specific. Also lower neuroticism, higher conscientiousness, so it's all like it should be. But something's missing. So what's missing from this figure? An important factor. Anyone? Yeah, that's a good one, but Estonians are quite introverted, don't care so. We are happy to be on our own. No, I'm joking, but it's a good guess, but it's not. No, but think about the components of subjective well-being. It's a really simple one.
I said gender.
Yeah, actually, gender differences in subjective well-being are very, very super small. So sorry. It's sort of like not just in Estonia, but everywhere. So gender doesn't seem to be a huge role. What's missing is positive emotions. I mean, it's one of the components of subjective well-being. So you've got neuroticism, which would represent negative emotions, but positive emotions just didn't matter. I mean, for Estonians. And I thought, how is it possible, You are satisfied with life when you have, when you don't have too many negative emotions. That's your sort of formula for happiness, And I thought, I found something really interesting. Finally, I know, something which is sort of I don't know, unique for Estonians or something. But I thought like, maybe we are not that unique at all. So because I did my postdoc in Belgium at the University of Leuven, I knew Peter Kippens, who's a really well-known researcher nowadays, in emotion research. I see some people nodding. So we were postdocs together, actually. He was still a doctoral student at the time when I was at Leuven. So I knew he had access to data sets with Ed Dina, in which they had data on positive emotions, negative emotions, and life satisfaction across 46 countries. Students, you use what you have. So normally I would have, of course, representative samples from European Social Survey and World Values Survey, but students, that was fine. Anyhow, so we found out that Estonia, to my great disappointment, was not an exceptional case, but it was just one example of a pattern. So what we found was that indeed, if you look at the relationships between negative emotions and life satisfaction and positive emotions, indeed the relationships are as they should be, but they are moderated by certain cultural level variables such as individualism and self-expression. And when I talk about self-expression, of course, I'm talking about this famous, well-known, maybe too many times used Inglehart-Welzel World Cultural Map. This is the most recent release, but it tries to describe all the values using just 2 dimensions. And I know Anneli has worked a lot with those dimensions. So if you have any questions at the end of the talk, you can just ask Anneli about those dimensions. But anyhow, we found that this dimension, which is survival versus self-expression, moderates the relationship between positive emotions and life satisfaction, so that, you need more positive emotions in those countries which are high on self-expression. So this is Protestant Europe, English-speaking countries, so this is what we call like advanced Western countries. In those countries which are still sort of like, in terms of values, are more focused on survival, you don't need so many positive emotions. It's absolutely fine if things are just going okay, but you don't need this kind of positive stimulation. Yes. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Not a psychologist, so maybe it's a very stupid question.
Yeah.
I always thought well-being is something which may go up and down, but it's not erratically going up and down. Now you say we need these positive emotions, but that, my half knowledge tells me, this is really something of the moment.
It's a really good question, and we could have another session on what is your mood, what are your emotions, how sort of they fluctuate, and so on and so forth. But a brief answer would be that your mood is relatively stable, and it's also related to your basic personality traits. And actually, I will reach to this point later in my talk when I talk about the relationships between personality and different components of subjective well-being. And I'm trying to explain why these 2 things are related. Maybe that will answer your question. Would that be okay? If not, you can ask me again at the end of the talk. Would that be okay? Good. So why is it important to talk about different components of subjective well-being? Let me go back to my sort of initial point. So I hope you're convinced that the picture is a bit more complex than we initially thought. They are related, yes, but, in different cultures, relationships differ, and so on and so forth. To make it even more complicated or complex, actually, if you look at the sort of like what predicts what, you see that different components of subjective well-being have different relationships with different important individual level factors. So this is a very simple study. We actually investigated people who had a knee or hip replacement surgery. So we asked them about levels of pain and stiffness and all kind of objective measures. Can you walk? how painful it is, personality traits, as well as sort of like, use of painkillers, but also self-rated health. And as you can see, the relationships, we are kind of predicting because we had before and after measurements. As you can see, life satisfaction was only predicted by self-rated health. And I will come back to this sort of evaluative component of life satisfaction later as well. Whereas negative emotions and positive emotions were actually related to more objective indicators. So you see, it's a completely different sort of like set of relationships for different components of well-being. And the same thing happened in one of our more recent studies, which we ran together with colleagues at the University of Warwick. So we recruited a sample of Warwick employees who downloaded an app, and so we rewarded them for sort of like physical activity. So they wanted to get like, more active physically, and they got like certain rewards when they were using this app. So we had altogether 5 measurements at the start of a trial, 1 month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, and also a year later. Sadly, we didn't ask for life satisfaction, but we have data on physical activity, positive emotions, and negative emotions. And as you can see from this figure, self-reported physical activity went up and until it dropped. so much about interventions, yes. So 12 months later, so we stopped using the app as well, I guess. Life satisfaction, yes, it follows the same trend as physical activity. You think you are more physically active, your life satisfaction improves. We don't know what happened, but I guess it dropped too. Positive emotions, the same story, goes up, goes down again. But negative emotions, nothing. It's literally like flat line, So it shows again how important it is to look at different components of subjective well-being if you're trying to predict something or if you're trying to change something, whatever, because they may have completely different relationships with external variables or predictors or outcome variables. So if we think subjective well-being is important, if we think it has different components, of course we would like to know where does it come from? What are the determinants of subjective well-being? The eternal question, what makes us happy? It's a very simplistic figure I found from a Cambridge handbook. I thought, I wasn't sure such things are actually being printed, but this is actually from a relatively recent handbook. You have environment, you have genes, all together, subjective well-being. I didn't adjust it. I just thought I have to show it as it is. Luckily, we also had a slightly more nuanced figure, which I'm going to sort of describe in a greater detail. More specifically, I'm just going to go through different parts of this, not all of them. And I'm going to focus mostly on my own research because I thought it's a keynote, but I will also mention some important research by other people. So let's start with genes. It's well known, at least there are quite a few studies, and a few years ago there was this paper published which claimed that, subjective well-being has a genetic basis. If you look at twin or family studies, you see this average heritability of 0.30, 0.40. Of course, if you use a GWAS, you don't get such high heritability estimates, but this is for most phenotypes, so subjective well-being is not like any different. At the same time, heritability is not fixed. Interestingly, culture comes in again because environment seems to matter, population traits and measurement tools, so there is quite a bit of flexibility around it. And also, we argue specifically in this paper, in this review paper, that environment matters more. It's sort of like subjective well-being happens to be somehow, as many things in life, between sort of our genetic predispositions and environmental influences, and maybe environmental influences are a bit greater on subjective well-being than genetic background. And interestingly, again, going back to my previous point, life satisfaction seems to be less genetically influenced. And maybe this is something I will talk about later when I talk about genetic overlap between personality traits and positive and negative emotions. So anyhow, what data shows is that, according to some studies, life satisfaction, which is a cognitive aspect of subjective well-being, shows lower heritability than emotional components. So we can also talk about individual box, which is, of course, maybe I should go back. Of course, there are many, many different things you can talk about when it comes to individual. I chose not to talk about those things because simply being conscious of time. And also gender differences, I already answered someone's question. There are no gender differences anyhow, so that's sort of like sorted. Age is a very sort of more interesting thing. I could talk about age as well. If you ask me questions, I'm happy to talk about it. Education, socioeconomic status, and so on and so forth, but I'm not going to talk about it. So I will focus on personality. I will focus on personality traits more specifically. And of course, you could also say that this is actually all, I don't know if you can see it, both of you who are sitting back there, but this is actually behavior. This arrow is thinking, and this is experience. So from some perspective, you could argue that if you think about personality from a broader perspective, this is all personality, because if you look at the definition of personality traits, you see it's about basic tendencies or dispositions rooted in biology, have strong genetic background, which can be described as stable tendencies to think, feel, and behave in certain ways. So from that perspective, you could argue that this is all personality, but I'm just going to focus on this small box right now. So what we know, there are many studies. It's a very, very popular topic. So the easiest thing to do is just to look at some meta-analytic relations, which have sort of collected data from more than 300,000 individuals and 462 studies. So it's really impressive sort of work. I'm just going to focus on the Big Five. I'm sure you know it. I didn't prepare any slides on the Big Five. If you don't know it, you can just Google and look it up. Although it's not the only personality taxonomy, of course. You know, we could also talk about the 6-factor, 2-factor, 3-factor, 16-factor, whatever. But, you know, I'm just going to focus on these 5, which are well-known personality dimensions. And yeah, so you can see how subjective well-being is... or maybe I should go by personality traits. Neuroticism seems to be related to all 3 components, most strongly to negative affects, but also negatively to subjective well-being, broadly speaking, satisfaction of life, and positive emotions. Extroversion is positively related to satisfaction of life and positive affects, and conscientiousness shows also some correlations, slightly smaller ones with different components of subjective well-being. So this is all what we would expect. Of course, across studies, there are some differences, but this is broadly how it works. And it's quite consistent. If you don't get such correlations, something's really wrong with your experiment. But I think instead of just talking about relationships, I thought it would be interesting to focus on why personality and subjective well-being are related, because why do we see those relationships? And I came up with 4 different reasons, so there might be more, but this is what I could think of for this talk. And I tried to go through each of those reasons with some examples, mostly from our own research, but occasionally also talking about colleagues' papers. So, of course, the first possibility is that, you know, theoretically speaking, personality causes subjective well-being. So if we think about different personality theories, that kind of makes sense. It means traits are causally prior to subjective well-being, and they shape environments, habits, interpretations, everything influencing subjective well-being. So that goes really well, I think, kind of makes sense. I think we could argue this. especially when knowing that personality traits are also genetically predisposed. But at the same time, there are also quite some mediators, what we've discovered, like, for instance, emotion regulation styles, goal pursuit, self-control, social relationships, life choices, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to talk about is very briefly a study which we just conducted last year, and this is about self-control. So it's a nice mediator between personality and could serve as an explanation why personality or how personality is related to subjective well-being. So self-control is a capacity to regulate one's behavior, emotions, and impulses. Literally, like, you're able to persist some temptations in order to reach your long-term goals. So this is a classic definition of self-control. And what we hypothesized was that maybe self-control actually serves as a mediator between personality and subjective well-being. And indeed, what we found was that neuroticism as well as conscientiousness, measured at time 1, predicted life satisfaction at time 3. We used 3 different data sets, longitudinal data sets from Australia, from Germany, from United States. So quite nice sample sizes. So how about self-control? And self-control indeed actually partially mediated very sort of impact of neuroticism and conscientiousness of life satisfaction across all 3 samples. So that was a consistent finding. When we did the same thing for positive emotions and negative emotions, it actually only worked in 2 out of the 3 samples, and the effect sizes were much weaker. So this is a bit like, I'd say, for life satisfaction, it really makes sense. Self-control seems to mediate a relationship, meaning that neuroticism and conscientiousness do not have like maybe an independent sort of impact on life satisfaction, but this impact is being mediated by self-control. But for positive and negative emotions, it was, as I said, in just 2 samples, and the effect sizes were weaker. So I could sort of talk about different mediators, but let's move on to the next part, which is bidirectional effects, because it's also possible that, it's not just personality which is causing subjective well-being. It may well be that, a thing goes sort of like there's a reciprocal relationship between these 2 constructs. And it may well be that indeed personality affects subjective well-being, but long-term well-being may also, or ill-being, may shape personality over time. And here I don't really have, maybe I do, but I couldn't think of any good example of our own study. So I'm showing it's not the right year. Sorry, I just noticed it's definitely not 2025. It's 2015. So it's a really nice study from our Dutch friends and colleagues, Hans Ormel and Bertus Hieronymus, in which they investigated the change in neuroticism and across 16 years. And we also had information about different kinds of life events, life quality, which could be seen as a proxy to subjective well-being. Anyhow, neuroticism was highly stable, as we would have expected, because personality traits are relatively stable. But at the same time, they found that, long-term difficulties, sort of like life difficulties, and also worsened life quality, it actually predicted lasting increases in neuroticism. So we could argue, we could use it as an argument that, long-term ill-being also influences personality traits, and also improved life quality, for instance, predicted lasting decreases in neuroticism. But in the end, what they said, neuroticism still, because there are still sort of like, it's an ongoing debate, let's put it this way, amongst personality researchers to what extent life events change people's personality. If something happens to you, will you become a different kind of person? Definitely some change happens, but the change is not like as dramatic as people seem to think. And also in this study, they showed that actually it was neuroticism which predicted life circumstances more consistently than the other way around. So it may well be that because of your level of neuroticism, you end up in certain situations, not the other way around. So, right, how about shared causes? Because with any relationship, it's also possible that it's not just a relationship, it's because there is another factor, behind these two, which kind of like influences a relationship. And of course, genetic overlap is a good guess, because I already showed you that our subjective well-being is highly genetic. The same goes for personality. And there are even studies, this is quite an old one from 2008 already, which explicitly said in its title that happiness is a personality. Happiness is a personality thing. So using a sample of twins from Scotland, they sort of showed that subjective well-being, actually they just measured life satisfaction, but they used the term subjective well-being even though they only measured life satisfaction, is linked to personality by common genes, and that personality may form an affective reserve relevant to set point maintenance and changing in set point over time. I'm not going to get into this set point theory thing because I'm sure many of you know this anyhow, and it's been widely discussed in well-being and personality research as well, and literally very briefly saying it means that it was proposed that people have certain set points of life satisfaction or subjective well-being, meaning that whatever happens, goes up and down, life happens, but you kind of like go back to your set point, and this has been refuted by other researchers later. But this gives me a wonderful opportunity to talk about some research done by my good colleagues, and it kind of started with us. And other people also followed in our footsteps. So back in 2007, I think 2008, me and Anu Realo, he's definitely the most prominent psychologist in Estonia, so that's absolutely fair. So we started a collaboration with the Estonian Biobank, Estonian Genome Center. It was like we were talking about this year. So the number of people who had joined the Estonian Biobank at the time, it was fairly small. But the head of the Estonian Biobank at the time, Professor Andres Metspalu, he was very sort of like true visionary, and he already at that time, he thought like it would be super interesting to add, personality measurement to Estonian Biobank. So we used Europaea. Those of you who are not personality psychologists, that doesn't tell you anything, but those of you who are, it's 240 items. Crazy. And we did it. And people did it. I mean, it's like 3,620. And not people themselves, but I think it must have been the idea of Professor Warwick, who said because of measurement problems, measurement bias, we shouldn't just rely on self-reports, but let's have informant ratings as well. So we asked the people who joined the Estonian Biobank, to find someone who knows them that well, who completed the same measurement inventory for them. So we had this fairly unique data set for 15 years, I dare to say, with 3,600 something participants with full personality, well-being, all sorts of other data, self-reports and informant reports. And it was even taken further by Rene Mõttus and Uku Vainik, my good colleagues from psychology departments at Tartu, and they used another shorter personality survey, and with public campaigns, with the help of Estonian Biobank, you also see how the number of participants in the Estonian Biobank has exponentially grown. They were able to recruit 77,000 participants. So that's already something. And also quite a fair number of those also have like observer ratings. So we have published, I don't know, 40, 50, whatever papers on this first data set. We have participated in different sort of like consortia type studies, investigating the genetics of whatever traits, including personality traits. But now what I'm talking about it is this most recent paper, which I'm not even sure if it's been published, but it's going to be published in JPSB by Rene Mõtsis and Uku Vainik and colleagues, in which they used twins. Because if you have such a large sample of participants, accidentally, you also end up with a fair amount of twins. So they used twins from this study and also did some other tricks. But anyhow, they said that life satisfaction was as heritable as personality traits, sharing about 80% of genetic variants of neuroticism, extraversion, and conscientiousness. You see the same three, which always happen to be related with some components of subjective well-being. And even more importantly, about half of life satisfaction's phenotypic relations with neuroticism and extraversion, and its entire correlation with conscientiousness were explained by shared genetic factors. So that kind of tells you that something's really going on there, and personality and life satisfaction at least seem to have something in common, which is common genes. And that might be one of the reasons why we see relationships between these two. But, and there is always a but, it could also be a methodological artifact. And it's possible because of shared method variance, because we are talking about self-reports. I ask you to report on your subjective well-being. I also ask you to report on your personality traits. I ask you to report on whatever thing. It's all you, and it may well be that you are biased or you have this sort of anyhow. So it's important to use different methods, different sources of data, and this is what we did. In this JPSV paper, which was published last year, we used both self and informant reports, so we were able to get rid of this shared methods variance. So we used Estonian biobank sample, 21,000 people. Again, it was led by Rene Mõttis. And again, conscientiousness, extraversion, and neuroticism showed up as, the most significant factors, personality factors related to life satisfaction. And if you want to know, I really like it because Rene has been also one of the sort of advocates in personality psychology in favor of nuances. So, he's written quite a few papers on this topic, like we shouldn't really talk about those big five, big two, whatever, big few. We should focus on nuances instead, sort of like narrower personality traits. So if you want to know, how do you tell if a person is satisfied or not satisfied with their life? The first sign is they feel being misunderstood. So if somebody tells you that nobody gets me, nobody understands me, most likely they are not satisfied with their life. And also if they are unexcited, indecisive, envious of other people, they look bored, sad, unable, unrewarded. These are all sort of like more nuanced signs of someone being not satisfied with their life. And of course, why I'm talking about it is because at the level of those nuances, the true correlations between personality traits and life satisfaction were even higher. So it's sort of, they predict better life satisfaction than those big sort of 5 personality factors or traits. So we kind of controlled for shared methods variance, but it's still possible that, there is certain affective bias in reporting, or even more significantly, what really concerns me is this conceptual overlap between constructs and items, because sometimes I feel like we are literally asking about the same thing, we are just calling it differently. And now I come to your question about emotions. So many years ago, and that was part of my doctoral thesis, and that was like, I'm talking about 1990s, when you could easily publish a paper in a very good journal, just having a sample of 358 undergraduate students, people would be laughing at you nowadays when you try to publish something like this. Anyhow, what we were interested in, we were truly interested in the relationships between negative effects, positive effects, and different personality traits. And we showed that the relationships are indeed fairly strong, sometimes stronger than between different facets of neuroticism, for instance. So something's going on there. And this is what we said in this paper. I had to look it up for this talk because I wasn't sure if we actually said it out loud, but we said, indeed, that positive and negative effect form a temperamental basis for the two most salient personality dimensions, neuroticism and extraversion. Of course, we are not the first one to say this, but anyhow, we said it as well. So if we already argue that positive emotions and negative emotions, which also happen to be components of subjective well-being, are actually fundamental components of personality traits, so why wouldn't we see relationships between these two things? So yeah, so we still have some, I think, some unsolved issues there. So, how much time do you have? What time is it? Can I keep talking?
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, sure. No, later on. Okay, later on, keep it. We have some, yeah. Yes, we have some order. Well, could be. Yeah, restraint. Yes, it's all about self-control. You see, exercise some self-control. So, yeah, anyhow, let's move on to the next part of this figure. We are talking about experience. And of course, experience could be anything. And I'm not even going to talk about everyday activities. There are wonderful papers, how different activities completely drain you. Commuting, at least in the US, commuting is the worst, but also, when you have to call your mom, sometimes it could be draining, and there are all sorts of things. Anyhow, it could be like social relationships, of course, health, sleep, physical activities, and so on and so forth. So I'm not going to talk about those things. I'm going to focus on this part, which is thinking. And I thought this is really interesting, because this is what we've shown. Is it actually your perception that counts? Or what is it when it comes to well-being? So this is a fairly recent study from Warwick. Anita was my doctoral student. It was part of her doctoral thesis. And she ran this really cool study with colleagues and friends. It was an experience sampling study, which we've used extensively in our research. As I said at the start of my talk, so that was with British English undergrads. And we were interested in to what extent different sleep parameters influence well-being. And I can actually say, influence, because I'm sure you know how experience sampling studies work, but you ask people to report on something. We ask them to report on their emotions, life satisfaction, all sorts of different activities, social interactions for 2 weeks, 5 times a day, and also every morning after they had woken up. We asked them to complete a sleep diary, so that was about last night's sleep. And we also wore actigraphs, so we had, so to say, objective. Yeah, well, nothing's objective, but it's kind of objective-ish measurement of sleep as well. So we had all sorts of indicators of sleep. So we wanted to know to what extent sleep affects people's subjective well-being. And what we found was that actually it was only out of all indicators, objective, whatever indicators of sleep, sleep duration, sleep quality based on actigraph measures, when people went to bed, when did they get up, and all sorts of things. Nothing was related to subjective well-being, to any of those 3 components, because we always measure all 3 for reasons I just explained at the start of this talk, because you have to measure them separately. But it was only one factor which was related to subjective well-being, and that was sleep satisfaction. So you just ask people, how well did you sleep last night? And it didn't matter what the objective indicator showed. It was not related, but it was all about what people think about how well they slept. So what we argued is that it's sleep satisfaction, not the objective sleep quality, which was linked to subjective well-being. And literally simply thinking you had a good night's sleep seems to be more significant to your subjective well-being than actually getting a good night's sleep. And this story, I mean, this paper was picked up by so many newspapers, and we gave quite a few interviews because if you think about the sleep business, which is all about monitoring, your sleep, like different rings and different apps and everything, and it's kind of like, I'm not saying you shouldn't do this, but it should be used with some caution because it's all in your head to some extent when it comes to your well-being. And it's not just about, and it was consistent across different components of subjective well-being, so about people who were more satisfied with their sleep. They also had higher levels of positive emotions next morning, lower levels of negative emotions, and higher levels of life satisfaction. And it's not just about sleep, it's the same for health. So we've investigated, or we've been examining self-reported health in many, many studies. And this is just a country level nice graph to show you where we investigated the relationship between self-reported health status and life satisfaction using the data from European Social Survey once again. And it's a nice linear positive relationship. Well, the same applies at the level of individuals. It's just nicer to show it this way because you can see how countries nicely line up. But it's the same at the level of individuals. Whenever you ask people what is the sort of how satisfied or what is their health status, and you ask them also how satisfied they are with their life, it's always a strong positive relationship. But go back to this sort of figure I showed you at the start of this talk because it's just one it's just self-rated health again. So it's not the objective indicators of health which are related to life satisfaction. So when we specifically focus on life satisfaction, as people often do, calling it subjective well-being, it's slightly misleading because it actually just related to this evaluative component which is self-rated health, and it's less related to objective parameters. And we showed the same thing with the data from the Estonian Biobank in another study, because in the Estonian Biobank we also have information about people's objective diagnosis. And when I'm saying objective, of course, you have to go and see a doctor. If you don't go and you are super sick, you just join the Estonian Biobank and you are like super, super ill, but you never go and see a doctor. Of course, we wouldn't know about your objective health issues, but most people go and see a doctor. There is a record, it's all recorded, and we had access to those medical records. And it's the same thing. It's subjective health rating, which is related to life satisfaction and not these objective health indicators. So the last part, before I finish my talk, is about environment. And of course, again, with environment, I could talk about many different things. I'm not going to talk about those things, even though we know about the importance of green space and living standards, and the environment could be defined very, very broadly. I'm just going to sort of I thought you could also argue that country or nation is also part of environment, could be at least seen as such. And I thought I'll end this talk with some cross-national differences in subjective well-being, but I thought I'm going to give it a slightly different twist, because you are in Estonia. Estonia is very close to another country, which is Finland, which happens to be the happiest country on earth. And whenever I talk about it, I'm reminded about my good friend who sadly passed away quite some years ago. He was a psychologist at the University of Iceland in Reykjavik. I spent quite some time at this university as a visiting scholar and visiting professor many years ago. And it was about the time when Iceland was on the top of happiness rankings. And nobody in Iceland could ever understand this. Like, they thought, like, people are absolutely mad, what's going on? Oh, are you crazy? And Friedrich, my good friend, he used to say, the happiest place in Iceland for me is a Keflavik International Airport. So literally, like, that was, yeah, anyhow. So I thought I'm gonna ask you and tell you what I think, why is Finland the happiest country in the world for the 7th time, maybe already it's the 8th time, I'm not sure anymore. But anyhow, you see, we're so close, so it's sort of, just the Gulf of Finland between us. So, of course, there are all sorts of different factors which people have proposed. First, you have to look at the latitude. Sadly, Iceland is up there, so that gives you an idea how up in north we are. So, and this is supported by a paper by, it's Van der Vliert and Van Lange, and Dutch colleagues and friends who published this paper and said, if you look at the differences, I should have said there are large differences in happiness, life satisfaction across countries, that goes without saying. So it's all about, latitude. It's a U-shaped curve. People are obviously happy up in north. I highlighted Finland for you, but also down south, New Zealand, Argentina, and they happily ignore this part, which is somewhere sort of but still have high levels of life satisfaction. So maybe, the U-shaped curve is not as perfect as it seems. And of course, if that was true, Estonia should have much higher, levels of happiness as well. So I think we should look further. It's been proposed that, for instance, it's about proximity to nature. And also this sort of low population density Finland is well known for. And of course, again, it makes sense. It sounds like a reasonable sort of argument in favor of high levels of happiness, but it's definitely not unique for Finland because there are quite a few other countries in the world which also where people are quite close to nature and also which are not that populated, but at the same time they don't have that high levels of life satisfaction. So I thought, when I was thinking about it, it's all about this sort of sauna sisu and Sibelius, or sauna sisu and Sibelius. So it's sort of, Estonians of course know all about it. Most people also know what sauna is, which is also hugely popular in Estonia again. We should probably see high levels of life satisfaction and happiness. Sisu, I don't know how many of you know what is sisu. It's a very specific Finnish term, which even according to Finns, cannot be quite properly translated into any other language. So I'm going to give it a try. So I wrote a sort of short paper about it for Psych Today a few years ago when I was in Finland. So it's literally sisu is something you just keep going, even if it's it's almost hopeless, but it's not quite hopeless, but you still sort of push forward and keep going. So it's seen as a national character of Finns, and perseverance, that could be one term, but it's not quite perseverance because it's also it sometimes goes a bit too far. So you can have sisu, too much sisu, if you see what I mean. You should stop. It's you stop doing what you're doing, but you still do what you do. But anyhow, they think it could be one reason for Finnish high levels of happiness. And of course, Sibelius, you all know, it's a great composer, and Finns are extremely proud of him as well, even though his music is not exactly something which would cheer you up, although I love it. So I think it's more about things which are related to trust, and it's one of the one of the topics I've been interested in for many years. So it's related to social capital. It's sort of like to what extent people trust each other in a society. And we see there are dramatic differences in this, ranging from, 74 in Denmark to 2% in Zimbabwe. If you ask people like to what extent to trust other people in general. And Finland, together with Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Iceland are right on the top. Also China. You can ask me about China later. I have some good explanations for China scoring so high. But anyhow, so all Scandinavian countries are on the top. And this is what I think is also one of the reasons for high levels of life satisfaction and happiness and subjective well-being in Finland, as well as in other Nordic countries. So this is related to general trust, which has been named as a Nordic gold. So it's like a reserve, something they have, or other countries don't seem to have, in such amounts. And I thought it's sort of like it's a virtuous circle of a good society. So it's you can't say, don't ask me what is a starting point, because it's literally like a circle. Different good features of a good society, they feed into each other and they support each other. So be it subjective well-being, good governance, super important when it comes to trust, wealth, absolutely important, high levels of gender, social and economic equality, high levels of trust, low corruption, and individualism also happens to be there. And when I talk about individualism, I don't mean like egoism, I mean true individualism, which is something I'm very passionate about as well. And this is more about being an autonomous person, but at the same time being responsible for your own actions and knowing what kind of impact your actions may have on people around you. So I think this sort of virtuous circle, and of course all these different factors, they've been related to life satisfaction at different times. Just, to remind you, because it is related to economy, this conference, I thought I have to show you one thing about like GDP or something. Wasn't quite sure what to show, but I thought that would maybe make a nice thing, because you can see how GDP and self-reported life satisfaction are indeed strongly related. So this sort of discussion about like is there a relationship between national wealth and life satisfaction, I think this is long over, so the correlation is definitely positive and relatively strong. But what I meant was this famous quote from Dina, Lucas and Oishi back in 2003. They tried to disentangle these different factors and were unable to, because they are so closely related, and they've been all related, what I showed you, they've been related to life satisfaction. But it's sort of like, I wouldn't say which one is more important, because they all have to come in this combination. Good governance, definitely. Low corruption, definitely. You can't have good governance without low corruption, and it's very, very difficult to have high levels of trust in a society if you have high levels of corruption, for instance. And subjective well-being is part of this circle, part of this picture. Right, so this brings me finally to my final words. I hope I haven't... it's time to finish. So we are still witnessing the era of well-being, but I wonder if it continues, because as with all topics we've seen before in psychology and social sciences, there are different trends. Individualism, collectivism used to be the key sort of buzzword in 1980s, 1990s even. Achievement, motivation, all sorts of different topics which have been hugely popular and forgotten. So is it going to continue for another decade? Political situation, what's happening in the world, we just have to wait and see. Maybe it will become even more important. What I like you to sort of like when you leave this, and if you didn't know this before, just, keep in mind that when we talk about subjective well-being, it is a multifaceted construct. So we should treat these components sort of like separately. They are related, of course, but at the same time, they also show different relationships with external variables, and also their relationships may differ in different cultures. Also, that life satisfaction is inherently subjective. So I wanted to say subjective well-being is inherently subjective, but I thought I should better say life satisfaction. It is about your sort of cognitive appraisal, so that, when people evaluate their own well-being, it's all this one evaluative component. Is it your life? Is it your sleep? Is it your health? And so on and so forth. So, and actually these evaluations seem to be more important for well-being than actual, health records or sleep quality. Personality and subjective well-being are strongly related, and I tried to show you different reasons for this relationship. Hopefully, some sort of some food for thought. And when it comes to cross-national differences in subjective well-being, which could have been another topic for another talk, but I wanted to briefly mention this as well. It may reflect features of a good society, so it seems to be a virtuous circle, and subjective well-being is just one component of this virtuous circle of a good society. So acknowledgements, of course, I haven't done all this research on my own. I've been extremely lucky and privileged to work with many wonderful researchers from University of Warwick, from University of Tartu, of course. Also, our collaborators, this is just for well-being, this is actually just for those papers I mentioned. This is not a full list of my collaborators. And also we've been lucky to get some funding to do this kind of research. And I thank you for your attention, and I wish you a wonderful evening, a good conference. I hope you will enjoy Tartu, which is fantastic even when it rains and it's grey skies. Or maybe one last thing, a few years ago we did a study, quite a few years ago, we did a study where we examined the relationship between positive and negative emotions and weather. So we used an experience sampling data set again, so 14 days, people reported 7 times a day on how they felt, and we got, the exact measurements of wind, rain, sunshine, whatever, from this sort of like weather station located in the same city. And literally there are no relationships between your emotions and weather conditions. So I trust you will be happy anyhow, even if it rains. So so thank you for your time. And hopefully if you still have, you can go and enjoy your dinner, or I can take some questions, or we can discuss in private, as you like. But thank you.
If you are not overly tired, I think we still have time for some questions. So I will ask you to share your question first.
And well-being is the mechanism of care. So this was really
Good. It's all sorted. I told you.
So I will give the opportunity to myself to ask you a question.
Of course.
I had this conversation with my co-authors from University of Oslo several years ago, and they said that the problems with Finns is that they have low expectations. And this is why they evaluate their life as the best possible life, because this is how it is measured in World Happiness Report. While the problem with people from Norway is that they heighten their expectations. So that's why they are not so high. So maybe there is another advice for the good society, just lower your expectations.
Yes, that's what I think it's also a generational thing, because if I think about my parents' generation, this is definitely something they would have advised us, but I think it's quite the opposite nowadays. And I'm not sure if it's true. It's an interesting theory, though. And it may work. What I've noticed, based on my life experience and my life in the UK, what I've noticed is different, in addition to those things I mentioned, is that, I wouldn't say it's proximity to nature, but I think it's easier to have simple pleasures in this part of the world because of maybe class differences are not that prominent, and of course Liam may counter-argue, and maybe I'm just biased because I haven't really penetrated the English society to the extent I should have. But it seems like you can just go for a swim if you fancy, and you don't have to book ahead and find a swimming club which opens once a week and supports wild swimming. I can just jump into a lake, anywhere, in Estonia and Finland. It's sort of like simple joy in such things. Maybe that could be also one of the reasons, on top of low expectations. Can't say it.
Low expectation in the good sense. Not
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, do you have any other questions? So I see Leo at the back. And, too many hands. I cannot count. Leo was the first I noticed. That's the power,
I think you have to go back to this sort of my circle of, what's a good society, because we shouldn't just make people happy. I don't think this is going to work, because I also think that, there are different things what people want to do, but if as a society you can provide, basic standards of living, you can have, fair elections, people feel that they can have a say, there is not too much inequality in a society. I think all these things matter, and that would be my main advice to any policymaker, try to reduce the level of corruption, because it's impossible to have high levels of trust. For instance, if there is, a high level of corruption in a society. So I think these are the things we should be working on, and not trying to enhance individuals' happiness, because that's going to be an impossible task anyhow. People, in my understanding, people should be able to do what what makes them happy. And we didn't talk about social relationships, for instance, which is a hugely important part. And some people say it's maybe the most important part of anyone's happiness, good social relationships. But you can't, how would you, you're not going to come up with any laws, to sort of, you could, but I don't think it would work. So, yeah.
Call your mother on Friday.
Yes, that should be a law, of course. So, yeah, it actually, this is an unwritten law, at least it used to be in China, this sort of, it's both supportive and demanding at the same time, sort of neediness of your family. So, no, good social relationships, yes. If anything, I didn't talk about, I haven't done any research on this, but I truly believe this is very important. But sorry, that's not an answer to your question.
Harriet?
Thank you for your talk. I was triggered by the thinking aspect in subjective learning. And I thought, would locus of control or attributions of the results of your behavior, would that be able to make you more or less happy? And maybe also social comparisons?
social comparisons are definitely bad, extremely bad for your well-being. Don't compare yourself to your colleagues or neighbors or anyone, because as soon as you think about yourself as, oh my God, I'm not doing so well, or even if you think you're doing better, it's still kind of like, as soon as you start thinking about it, it's already drains your well-being. So social comparison definitely, yeah, that's not going to work. Of course, there are certain individual differences again. There are certain people with certain personality traits, who would most likely thrive on such comparisons, but broadly speaking, I think that's not going to work. With internal, external locus of control, that was one of the topics which used to be extremely popular, back starting in 1960s, Julian Rotzer and the whole thing. It's, I'm sure I've seen some studies.
I have one.
Yeah, go ahead, answer.
Be published.
Yeah.
So it's not really working as a predictor, but it works like as a buffering resource against the diverse consequences of low levels of our other predictors. So, for example, if you have low income but high strong sense of control, basically your well-being is more or less on the same level as the well-being of people with high income.
Yeah, and yeah.
Could make you more or less happy. So it could also be a way to train people to become one.
Yes.
Yeah, to some extent, definitely. I'm sort of like, I have mixed feelings about such training programs, but I see why people do this, and I don't think it's a bad idea, but I'm just not sure if it actually works in the end, because you may see some short-term benefits, but is it really going to stick? Because people are sort of creatures of habit, and it's hard to break your habits and also your thought habits. And this is all about CBT and cognitive behavioral therapy. You go to see a therapist to get rid of your cognitive schemas. But back to your question, it reminds me of a relationship between religion and subjective well-being, or at least life satisfaction. And there are some studies which have strongly supported the idea of sort of like religious people being, I don't know, more satisfied, whatever, because they feel like there's someone out there, it's not just me who's, I didn't fail because of my own shortcomings, I failed because God wanted me to fail or something, it also gives you some support in hard times. So I think it's kind of related to this external, internal locus of control thing, because external locus of control is all about attributing your success, your failures, whatever, to those forces around you, and you can't really do anything about it. And in a way, it's a nice excuse, but also gives you consolation. So, yeah. I'm sure there are some more studies, but your study was a good one. So,
I will try to be randomly distributed here. So the lady at the back, the one, you.
Mm-hmm.
Like an overweight of happiness in the Nordic countries. We're talking about this Nordic goal and trust circle and so on. I was just wondering whether, because you also said that genes play a part. Do you know if there's studies that has looked at, for instance, serotonin levels, or maybe the Nordic people are just sort of bathed in serotonin all the time? Super happy. Anything could happen, or you could have any governance or whatever, and they would still be happy. Do you know if there's any research like this?
Yeah. There are quite some nice studies about how different and similar are people across Europe in terms of their sort of like, genetic composition. So Estonians, for instance, it's not a very popular idea, but if you take an average Estonian and you look at the genes, it's kind of hard to differentiate, sort of Estonian genes. It's possible, but you really have to look very closely. from neighboring Latvians and Russians, and because people have come and left, and they, sort of it's all about these different genetic influences. But Finns are slightly more different, but they're also different from Swedes and Danes and Norwegians. So Finns are on their own, kinda, and especially people who are a different ethnic group anyhow, who live up in north. So the Sami people, they have a completely different set of very different genetic background. But I think there are some studies, not explicitly showing this, but they're not different from that perspective. It's not like they're genetically just happy. And also, as we know, environment plays a huge role, so it's not just all about your genes anyhow. So, but it's a fair question, so thank you.
Okay, I think we'll have time for like 2 more questions. So, yeah, you?
Oh.
And then Vera?
Okay.
How do you define and how do you operationalize conscientiousness?
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is, I'm sort of struck by this relationship that you mentioned earlier on between high levels of self-expression and then happiness and then the northern country. So I was raised Protestant, and I feel like that Protestant religion works against self-expression, stifles self-expression. So I wonder how they
Yeah, it starts with conscientiousness, which is one of the big 5 personality traits. So it's about being a conscientious person, which means you try to do your job accurately on time when we talk about sort of people on the high end, because I didn't mention it, maybe I should have mentioned it. When we usually talk about personality traits, we talk about dimensions these days. So we no longer try to sort of categorize people into distinct or discrete groups. So we talk about dimensions, and we kind of expect, them to be, or people to be normally distributed. So when I say people high in conscientiousness, I mean the ones who are on the high end of a dimension. So they are punctual, organized, plan ahead. When something needs to be done, they do it on time. So these are the people we rely on, like, somebody who keeps their words, well organized. So this is sort of like, no exact definition, but that's the essence of conscientiousness, I would say. And in different personality theoretical frameworks, it also has different sub-facets or sub-themes. So it could be like, I don't know, order, for instance, being a really orderly person, or sort of planning well ahead, and so on and so forth. So that's the definition of conscientiousness. And when it comes to self-expression, so this is one of the Ron Inglehart, who was an American political scientist. I'm sure, I don't know, where should I stand? Should I maybe stand here so that I can see all of you? So he was the one who established the World Values Survey back in 1980s. And he had this theory about like also value change, which is no longer supported, by the way, because that's one of the things I didn't have time to talk about, and this is for another time, to what extent when we talk about changes in the levels of subjective well-being, for instance, across age, is it really age, or is it period, is it cohort, and so on and so forth? And Inglehart had this wonderful theory about value change using these 2 dimensions. So he argued that with sort of like modernization, countries, if you do remember this colorful sort of figure graph, countries move up on the traditional versus secular rational dimension. So, countries modernize, they become richer, and people move away from traditional authorities like gods, become less religious, or tribal leaders, whatever, so they become more secular rational. And with post-modernization, Engelhardt proposed, countries start moving towards greater self-expression. And this is all about like, yeah, maybe it's not a good term, but what it means is you are no longer fighting for your survival, so to say, because you have enough means. It's highly related to GDP. But you can spend time on, you have more resources also cognitively, but also financially, and you can do things like, I don't know, volunteering, and you become more tolerant. And this is what happened if you look at the data, you know, in 1980s, 1990s, even 2000. So you could see how countries, including the Nordic ones, they really moved up and away from sort of rest of the world in terms of like becoming more self-expressive in those terms, high levels of well-being, high levels of interpersonal trust, higher levels of, I don't know, tolerance and so on and so forth. But what we see now, and Engelhardt sadly, or maybe, I don't know, yeah, sadly passed away some years ago, what we see now is that this theory applied to a certain period of time. And now literally like with increasing resources like wealth and whatever, countries are no longer becoming more rational and secular and no longer more self-expressive, and this is a world we are right now. So just, you know, this group of Scandinavian, Estonia included, some Western European countries, they have moved away to this right, upper right corner, and the rest of the countries are sort of like, despite in sort of high levels of national wealth, have pretty much stayed where they are. So what Engelhardt witnessed and based his theory on was this sort of Fukuyama style, you know, end of history type of thing, because he was using real data, but it was generational / period effect, because even with longitudinal studies, we struggle, we think like we follow people across their lifetimes. You know, we start, I don't know, monitoring, following them when they are kids, and we follow them up to 100 years, and that tells us, like, you know, we can sort of see age differences as they happen. But how do we know it's not cohort effect? People born in 1950s may have different age trajectories than people born in 1980s, for instance, or 2000s. So we really need like longitudinal studies across different, you know, periods of time. We are slowly getting there, but you can't do it in your lifetime because yeah, you have to leave something. But anyhow, I hope it answered your question that it's self-expression in this sense.
I think we have the time for the last question, and that would be Vera.
Thank you for your talk. My question is a bit related to parents. What about social media? Because it seems that it has been destroying happiness and well-being all over, at least in Brazil, totally.
Yeah.
Here in the US also.
It's definitely a very important topic. I think our own study, we ran a study on the use of social media in young adolescents, and it was also a kind of experience sampling study, so we asked them, like, you know, to what extent you use social media before you fell asleep, and so on and so forth. We didn't see, to be honest, we didn't see any effects at all. So the amount spent of social media also sort of like, was it just browsing, was it active content creation? It didn't really play a role, but I would hesitate to generalize this to sort of more broadly. So it may well be that, you know, for people in different age groups, for people with different levels of, I don't know, different mental health issues, it may be an issue. And of course, it was still sort of within, I don't know, normal limits, the use of social media, you know, I don't know what's normal, of course, and the definition has changed so much, so you can't really say. So, yeah, broadly speaking, our study didn't show any relationships, but I think this is, I wouldn't sort of like, I wouldn't rely on this study too much, because I think it's becoming an issue not just, for children and teenagers, but also for grown-ups alike. So it's yeah. So I think it's across the board, and there are definitely some studies which have shown very, very sort of like negative relationships between, especially when it's like certain type of social media use, and it's just, yeah. I think in the UK they started a legislation, at least it was sort of initiated, that, certain social media platforms won't be sort of, allowed for children younger than something, can't remember anymore, and there are all sorts of sort of like, I think in different countries, in Australia, in different countries, people are trying to come up with some meaningful regulations. So, yeah, so it's an interesting world, I guess.
Well, thank you. We could go on for hours and hours, but we have to leave this building actually soon. So I would like to give a little present. It is from Eesti Pank, the central bank. It's small but valuable. Thank you very much. Maybe you want to, well, the other one is more valuable.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.